Bien, bonsoir à...
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a delight to be with you here for this last session of the day on a theme which is really, really important. We're going to be talking about tackling inequality. We have 50 minutes to talk about this, which is either too long or too short. We'll try and do what we can with the time that we have. I'm Pierre JACQUET. I'm a member of the Cercle des Économistes, and I have the honor of being the moderator of this session. With me, I have a brilliant panel. I'm going to introduce you to them by alphabetical order. You'll find their CVs on the website, so I'm not going to take up our time with that. So we've got Daron ACEMOGLU, who is joining us remote. He'll be on your screen. He's a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. We have Augustin de ROMANET, who's the CEO of the Aéroport de Paris group. We have Professor Branko MILANOVIC, who is a researcher at the Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality. We also have someone who's remote, Gabriela RAMOS, who is under General Director for Social Sciences at UNESCO. And to my right, I have Sven SMIT, who's a senior partner at McKinsey, and he is the CEO of McKinsey Global Institute. So on this theme of tackling inequalities, we are going to try to hear from our different speakers and address three main subjects: the nature of inequalities, what are they, why is this an important subject, then the impact of the cultural shocks we're suffering now, what are the consequences on inequality, and this need for the ecological transition, what's the impact of that on inequality, and also the third question, what do we do about it? Let's hear some ideas on this theme of inequality. So to get the ball rolling, I would like to make three observations. The first is, let us all wonder about the connection between growth and inequalities. We've been through some decades during which growth enabled us to swell up our living conditions, and growth seemed to be reducing inequalities. We perhaps got a bit confused between reducing absolute poverty and reducing inequalities, or between the notion of absolute poverty and that of relative poverty, which is much more in line with inequalities. So the first question, the link between growth and inequality. The second question, this belief that we have of the trickle-down theory, whereby growth would reduce inequalities, has focused on the size of the cake, on our GDP, and not really on other dimensions, which is a bit of a mistake, really. And it's not on how that cake is being divided up either. So the cake may be growing up. Even if you have a pretty small percent, you could have a bigger revenue. So there's a bit of a confusion there. And from my point of view, that has led to much more individualism, because we have been focusing on individuals and the individual's revenue and not individual in society. And I think this slant towards individualism is a result of failing to take inequality into account in public policy. So it really is time to put inequality on a par with growth. We need to protect social harmony, and I'm sure we're going to hear about that third point, the ecological transition, which means we need to have some major transformations. This is what was talked about, what has been talked about over the past 2 days, and it leads us to implement proactive policies to manage this transformation. And to manage it, we need social consensus. We need agreements behind these measures. And there we need to think about the impact on how things are shared out in all fields, such as energy. I'm going to hand the floor to our different speakers. I'll ask them kindly to be brief, and then we'll open the debate to the room and all of those who are connected by internet. So thank you very much for being with us and being so very active in our debate. I'm going to start by handing the floor to Daron ACEMOGLU.
I hope that you can hear us.
Thank you, Pierre, and it's my pleasure to be here. And I have 4 minutes to talk about modern inequality, and 4,000 pages would not have been long enough for a brief introduction. But let me try to make 4 points. And I think on the first one, I will build on what Pierre said. You know, in economics and in some other social sciences and policy debates, sometimes there is this contrast between inequality versus poverty, you know, whether people should care about inequality. For instance, if there is economic growth and you know, some groups are benefiting by 40%, others are benefiting by 10%. Inequality increases perhaps, but everybody's getting better off. Well, I think that's just an academic debate. The reality is that people do care about it. And if people do care about it, I think it's our duty as social scientists to understand why, how, and also deal with these inequality-related phenomena. And in fact, you know, this is part of my sort of broader research. You know, humans are extremely adaptable. We can live under very different social arrangements, highly hierarchical, very egalitarian, different notions of fairness, different notions of what is a social contribution. But the reality remains that there are feelings, impulses that go back to the very early stages of our existence as Homo sapiens that make us not react very well to huge imbalances in either power or economic might. And I think we have to sort of think about that in the context of broadly rising inequalities. But I would actually submit that today's inequality is in some sense more pernicious in these dimensions than might first meet the eye. And the reason for that is because the overall context in which the economy of almost all nations around the world have been transformed over the last 4 or 5 decades is based on a narrative that highlights the effects of technology, increasing demand for skills, some sort of meritocracy. So it actually makes inequality a more jarring problem because it is associated with some groups not being able to keep up with modern demands, or at least that is the story that is implied. And in fact, the reality is quite different from that because we certainly do not live in a meritocracy. And even if we were to live in a meritocracy, you know, what does it mean for some people not to take advantage of new technologies or globalization when they have actually grown up in communities that have not invested adequately in their skills or capabilities. But there's also another dimension I want to put as my last point. Again, both in economics and public policy, there is, in my opinion, an unproductive debate about technology versus other factors, with the implication that somehow technology represents the inevitable forces that increase inequality, for example, through some sort of inexorable skill-biased technological change versus other causes, certainly institutional ones, or perhaps even globalization, are more related to policies that have been adopted. I think that's actually quite a misleading discussion. And this is another core part of my research, and I'd be very happy to talk about this in the later Q&A. But my work, for example, documents, at least for the US, that technological factors have been predominantly important in both the overall inequality and why some groups, such as high school graduate workers, have actually lost in terms of real incomes. But it also shows that just like globalization, technology was a highly specific choice. There wasn't any inexorable exogenous process of technological changes, but there was an ideological as well as economic interest dependent path of technology forged along automation and other choices that weakened workers, especially workers that weren't in the engineering high-skill cadre. And in that sense, globalization was very complementary to technology, or these automation-type technologies, because globalization also sent some of the tasks that were previously performed by lower-skilled workers to other countries and in a way that exploited communication technologies. So in some sense, you know, the way that I view this, and again, of course, the details are open to debate, we have created a much higher level of inequality because of technological choices we have made, undergirded by certain institutional and political choices that have also evolved over this process. And in that sense, I also don't see any of this as growth enhancing. In fact, if you dig into the details, the technological choices have put too much emphasis on automation and have, in fact, slowed down some of the productivity gains that we could have made without this extent of automation. But let me stop here because I don't want to take time from my more insightful colleagues on the panel, so I look forward to being part of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daron. I'm sure you will come back in the discussion. Let me now turn to Branko Milanovic. Branko, the floor is yours.
Well, my 4 minutes, as Daron said, is actually want to write 4,000 pages. I would use 4 minutes to speak about global inequality. Just to start, you know, technically speaking, as many people know, global inequality is the result of two inequalities. Two inequalities within nation states, of which we will actually be speaking today, and inequality nation state. Now, inequality between states is still in an overall inequality. The rise of China, Vietnam, Indonesia, and other countries has reduced that component. However, it's still a component. The question becomes, how we reach that between nations inequality and what type of policies to follow? Now, let me put very generous steps, different ways to do that. One is faster growth of the and populous countries. It is important to mention populous countries because obviously a growth rate of equal percentage.
Branko, I'm sorry, we can't. Branko,
or if it happens in China.
Branko,
the second way to reduce inequality is policies of cooperation and aid between the rich part of the world and the poor part of the world. There is, for example, an area there where Africa, I think, plays an extremely important role. And when policy initiatives like the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative do play a role, and where actually I think the American current initiative of, to some extent, imitating China would also hopefully to have the process of convergence. And then the third part is migration. Migration from poorer countries to richer countries, almost by definition, and actually empirically it can be shown on the examples of migrants, reduces inequality, global inequality, and reduces global poverty. However, it might increase actually inequalities in both recipient countries and emitting countries. So this is why it's important to keep these different types of inequalities clearly in mind. As I said already, you can actually have an increase in both emitting country inequality, receiving country inequality, and overall decline in global inequality. Now, what are the most recent, how should I say, really significant challenges that we're facing? The first one is COVID, which obviously has had a tremendous impact on mortality, morbidity, but also income inequality. That impact, as we already are beginning to know, was not equally across the countries. For example, the just released US data show a significant decline, and I have to underline, decline in US inequality, probably the largest in the last 50 years. It may be very easily reversed because, as you know, that was the result of very proactive government policies in France, which was about 15% of GDP. But it is notable. We also know that in China,
we can't hear you. Excuse me, we can't hear you.
In urban inequality. And very interestingly, for the first time in 40 years, the decline of real income
Branko, I'm really sorry.
Quintile of the urban income distribution. So that was the effect of COVID, which also obviously had huge effects on different countries.
Branko, we can't hear you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The connection. The connection is very, very poor, Branko. We can't hear you. Je suis vraiment désolé.
I'm so sorry, Branko. I have to interrupt you. The connection is so poor, we can hardly understand what you're hearing. We apologize greatly. If I understand briefly, you're talking about the increase in global inequalities after an entire period when they had been going down. But regression has made it spike up again, and there are different solutions for this problem. The first solution would be economic growth in developing countries. The second would be the role of aid which is given to developing countries, and the third is migration. But of course, migration does bring with it its own problems of managing those migratory flows. So I apologize. It's not a complete summary of what he said because sadly the sound was so poor. The technology fairy was not with us on that occasion. I'm now going to hand the floor to Gabriela RAMOS. I'm crossing my fingers here and hoping that the quality will be better.
Thank you so much, Pierre. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, we can. We can. Thank you.
Does it work?
Yeah, it does.
Is it working?
Yes, it is working. Very good. Yeah. Yes. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much. Well, I'm hearing myself, so let me then cut my audio. Thank you so much. I would like just to thank you for inviting the social and human science sector of UNESCO to this very important conversation. I just want to bring the perspective of how much policies matter to reduce inequalities. And these policies not only in the public sector as we know it, but also decisions that the private sector can make, and decisions that the economics profession, we are in Aix-en-Provence, and I think it's a question of how much we also change the economic narratives that we have been advancing for so many years that you started addressing Pierre and also Daron, because we have now confirmation that inequalities breed inequalities. And we know that if you are born in a low-income family, you will have less chances to get quality education, less chances if your parents are not educated to reach university levels. In my own country, being born in the north means that you will have 7 years less of life expectancy. And we know that these vulnerabilities that were created by the high level of inequalities that many of our economists achieved even before the COVID crisis were just compounded massively by the COVID crisis. No surprise, as Branko has been demonstrating, how much, of course, advanced economies with more fiscal space could be in better place to counter the impact than countries with high informality and low capacities, low social protection systems, not very well working health systems. And therefore, the picture now, as Secretary General Gutierrez has portrayed in his common agenda, is one of an emergency call. And I think that this should be, inequalities should be the ultimate and the primer, or along with climate change, one of the primary elements that we need to tackle. We need to tackle because we need to understand the compounding nature. We need to understand that inequalities made us less resilient during the COVID crisis. We could not withstand the shock actually because of the way the initial conditions prevented us from advancing. And now from the perspective of the Sustainable Development Goals, what we have now is a real catastrophe, I may say, because if we think about gender equality, labor force participation of women have decreased because of the caring, additional caring activities, because they were overrepresented in the sectors that were impacted by the COVID crisis, in the health, in the services, in the caring, and also because of violence. But if you think about life expectancy, also a very steep decrease in my country, 4 years less of life expectancy, but in general 3 years. But at the same time, we know that some gain from the crisis. The most prepared corporates that expanded their services in the digital world, we know that they achieved market capitalizations that were higher than they were expecting, 3.5 trillion. And this, the ILO has said that this is equal to the impact of the job losses. So what do we go from here, and how do we address this? Well, first, to really try to understand better, measure better, dissect better, and I think that the work that Daron and Branko have been doing help in this domain. We are doing some analysis, for example, on how much we need to move away from this narrative of the growth first, and then you redistribute. I think that we need to bring the equality ex ante in the way we develop economic policies, the same way as we need to bring sustainability. Not only relying on material well-being, as you said, not only GDP, we need multidimensional measures. We also need to invest in people and consider investment in health and education and as investment, not a cost. Try to measure better the return, because they can also be considered insurances. And also I would say that we need to invest in government capacities. It has been striking how much even the most advanced economies, the governments were not in a pretty good shape to protect their societies to the shock of the COVID crisis. And I would like to say that for the economists to move away from this narrative that governments should intervene only when there are market failures, I think this is long overdue to change this and to invest in government capacities. And the final word, being UNESCO, I would say, let's bring more solidarity. We're very worried about the changing priorities because of the Ukrainian war, and more funds being moved to defense industry, and not to forget that solidarity from the north to the south is really expected to waive the impact of the pandemic and to waive these differences that we see among countries and within countries. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Gabriela.
Thank you very much, Gabriela, reminding us of the importance of solidarity. Yes, it's not just wanting it that's important. We can't just order it. We have to do something about making it happen. So I'm going to hand over now to Augustin de ROMANET. Thank you very much, Pierre. That's okay. I'm going to be speaking in French. Now, the subject is tackling inequalities. I'm going to try and tackle 3 inequalities to try and find 3 solutions. Tocqueville said in Democracy in America that democracy linked to the equalization of situations. This is what happened in the situations became equalized within states and between states. There was more equality. This trend then reversed. There was more inequality that was created afterwards. And with the increase in inequalities, there's a reduction in democracy. But I won't go into details about that. And of course, you have good inequalities and bad inequalities. Good inequalities are those that stimulate creativeness. The bad ones are those that undermine dignity. And the Chinese are very attentive, making sure that there aren't too many inequalities. A few years ago, somebody explained to me that Chinese communist leaders, the former regime, this is Tocqueville again, it was important not to make the same mistakes as the French regime, where there was the French Revolution that happened. So let's start with heritage inequalities. Since the 80s, they are going up. The 1% richest have 38% of all of the additional heritage accumulated since the 90s, whereas the 50% poorest have only picked up 2%. This is probably due to negative interest rates that fostered this leverage effect and increased income. And this is something that's been developed by Thomas Piketty. So we've had an increase in heritage inequality. And I've only got 4 minutes, so very quickly I'm going to talk about another theme. We need solutions. We need to think about heritage and inheritance, sorry. In France, there is a share of money that escapes tax, and that is life insurance. So I think that with the level of an heritage inequality, that the amount of sums that we have in life insurance are not even known. It's not a tax expenditure. The heritage that we have in life insurance comes out of the beneficiaries' inheritance. It's not easy today. It's not possible today what the share of inheritance tax is. And this is my first point. Now, with respect to heritage inequalities, we must have solutions that make it possible to give a sense of inequality and to finance measures for equal opportunities. The second subject is education. I'll just talk about 2 points. There's a great, interesting debate in the United States, and that is what Michael Sandel said about meritocracies. What does he say? Well, he explains that in the United States, those who are at the top of the pile, those who have done the best studies, believe that if they're there, it's because they have the most talent, they're the best. Whereas this is not exactly true, because if they've got to the top of the pile and they're part of the Ivy League, it's because they've had Chinese lessons, pony lessons, etc. So this questioning of meritocracy in the United States calls on lots of compensatory measures. We've got to give room to human values alongside academic values. And I could talk about Aristotle, but I'd stop there. And then there's the question of education in France, where you have the PISA studies showing that there's been a drop in level. So this educational inequality, I don't really need to go into details about the fact that it's crucial to be able to correct it. And then the third theme, because I've almost finished my 4 minutes, I've got a minute left, it concerns all kinds of inequalities that affect the dignity of people, whether we're talking about their living conditions, whether their accommodation conditions, whether area-specific inequalities or care inequalities, even inequalities between men and women. France is not a high-performing country when it comes to violence against women. In Spain, there have been some great programs where they've managed to eradicate violence against women. In France, we still have our work cut out for us, even though we have people working in this area. And hopefully the new minister will take over these questions. And in Fukuyama's book called Identity that came out in 2018, you have some great developments focusing on the fact that in the human mind there are 3 dimensions. There are 2 dimensions that are studied, desire and reason. And then there's a 3rd dimension, which is the need for respect. It's what he refers to as Plato's thymus. So as long as individuals feel that inequalities are unjustified enough that their dignity is affected, that's when you have conflict. In 2018, Fukuyama wrote an article to say that what he wrote about the end of history was a mistake, because he'd forgotten that as long as people's dignity is respected, there will be wars and conflicts, and that stability will not exist. And to conclude, I will say that it's all the more important to tackle this question of inequality. We must qualify what is wrong. From inequality, we have populism that emerges. And Fukuyama also said that Trump and the populism of Trump was fueled by the feeling that American workers felt that globalization had really benefited an elite. So it's an important challenge if we want to conserve what is threatened today, and that is democracy. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Augustin. I'm now going to hand over to Sven.
Here at my screen it says that we're going to talk in English about tackling inequalities. I don't know whether you see that too. I actually like tackling because you need to track it and you need to tackle it. There's lots of inequalities, and many things make inequalities bigger. Many people talk about income inequality. Many people talk about the inequality of policy measures, be it energy policy, be it climate policy, the inequalities of education. And you can pile up large amounts of inequality. But when you then look at one tracking that gets often done, which is income inequality, the beauty is income inequality globally has improved a lot. It's under real stress right now and during COVID, but over the last 30 years improved a lot. But income inequality often then goes, it's the pain in the middle class. The high incomes increase their income, the middle class is squeezed, and the bottom incomes actually increase. But what that completely ignores is what I think is the inequality of affordability. We are currently in an affordability crisis, and that thing already was building up for society in quite a while. If you actually measure what people buy and compare it to their income, it is always the bottom that is squeezed. And that doesn't get said that way. It's always called the middle class squeeze because that's what the income says. And where are they squeezed? Their energy prices went up, their education costs went up, their healthcare costs went up, and in this moment their food prices and a few other things are going up. When people hear there's 10% inflation, or 8 or 12, a number like that, that is an average. If you are very rich, I think that was patrimoine, and you went cash in January, and the market goes down 30%, and then you go back in, then you actually had a 30% deflation. And if 50% of your income goes to housing, education, and energy, you probably had something like 30% inflation. And I believe what is not understood enough in the inequality debate, that not only the worst part of inequality, but also the solution might be much closer on the affordability side than on the income side. The experiments to do retaxation and redistribution at a much higher level have shown that, you know, when Sweden went too far, it didn't work and so on. And we could probably do better, but the reality is that's not the side where the only solutions sit. How can we make affordable housing? We will have to build houses. That means also in your backyard. If you want affordable energy, I actually like what is being considered in France or already done, that the first kilowatts are cheaper and then it gets market price plus, so that there's an affordability solution to the problem. I don't believe income can solve this puzzle, which is accelerating for many, many reasons. We will have to talk about affordability. And the people that casually say, we're nicely simulating now the prices that are really good for a carbon price, do not understand that a quarter of society by next year, March or April, in most of Europe will run out of cash and all their equity. At this energy price, life is, even in the West, not affordable. And inequality will have to be solved on the affordability side much more than on the income side. And that will mean innovation in how to produce houses, innovation in how to produce energy, innovation in how to produce food. But not a callous elite thing. No, this is actually a good price, because this is roughly what we need to go and change the energy policy, or something else. Affordability. We are in an inequality of inaffordability.
Merci.
Thank you very much. So we've been around the table generally. We've talked about two of my questions, but we've forgotten about my last question, which was how do we manage this transformation that we have ahead of us, this environmental transformation, keeping in mind these inequalities. So it's a dual problem. How do we prevent more inequalities to be created? How do we make sure that the treatment of inequalities makes it even more possible to find a solution to this problem? So the debate is open. I can see that there are people at the back of the room with questions. Can we hand over the microphone to the people at the back of the room? Yes, the microphone is on its way. And please introduce yourself very quickly before you ask your question. In fact, I don't have a question. I just wanted to tell you that the screen went off, so it wasn't a question, it was a bug. But there is a question here.
Sorry, I do have a question. So it's for Sven SMIT. As he asked the question in English, as he gave the speech in English, I'm going to ask the question in English. Je disais juste que je vais poser la question en anglais, étant donné que...
So I'm going to ask the question in English, given that he gave his speech in English.
You talked a lot about inequality of affordability, and what do you concretely suggest to tackle this inequality of affordability? Thank you.
I will not answer all examples, but I'll give one example, which is housing. We know how to make houses a lot cheaper, and the other issue is land. There are experiments around the world that work, where people take inner cities, take out the old buildings, and basically say you build units that are affordable, and the people can grow with multiple units on one site, so from 1 box to 2 box to 3 box, I'm simplifying. But it cuts the cost of housing by 10. And there are possibilities at scale to do this, not even so close to the backyards of people that often oppose this. One issue in all of this is people that are currently owning houses are afraid to suggest more houses should be built because their equity will go down. And quite a lot of people who are decision makers on housing are actually having a disincentive to make houses cheap. But the technical solution for affordable housing completely exists, and the experiments in the world that have been done to do it are just there to be scaled. And it's different in different countries and so on, but there's many, many examples where this works. We just need to scale them.
Merci. Donc, deux questions ici.
So 2 questions here, thank you. We'll take the 2 questions and then we'll ask the panel speakers to respond. Yes. Apparently, there's a consensus to say that inequalities are going up. Personally, I've been coming to this event for several years, and what I'm seeing is that every year we're saying that, yes, inequalities are increasing. You know, there are policymakers who come, politicians, business heads, and they're all saying, yes, the inequalities are going up, and they're saying, yes, but we're going to do what it takes. And again, here we are. We're not only saying that it's continuing, but they're getting worse. So isn't it time today to ask the minority that is pampered to take part and to do their bit and to rise to tomorrow's challenges? Thank you. So there were several parts to your question, but there was one that was important. We're saying, so we all go to seminars, and we know that there's a problem, and we have to act to solve that problem. But, you know, understanding the problem and acting on it is proving to be very difficult. So that's the first aspect. Another part to your question was there is a solution, and perhaps we'll be able to go back to that other question in the debate. So my question is a little bit more general. Now, as the McKinsey representative explained, there are technical solutions to build houses like rabbit hutches. It's possible. But then you have the notion of acceptability, if you will. So in economics, we talk about gross national product. Perhaps we need to imagine a different formula. You know, we've invented gross national happiness, maybe. Perhaps we could imagine a formula that mixes a country's income with insertion into that income of with the insertion of the meeting of basic needs, housing, health, and education. Unfortunately, the world is a world of economists. We're here in Aix-en-Provence for this meeting. And the biggest virtue here is to get it wrong most of the time. So couldn't we imagine a formula that would take on board that notion of meeting the essential needs of populations? Thank you for your question. I'll come back to the panel. Let's start with Augustin. I can't see on the screen Gabriela and the others, Branko, but I think that I will be able to hand over to them so that they can respond to what's been said. Yes, thank you very much. So I'll let my friend from McKinsey answer the second question. So you're saying the pampered minorities are not doing anything. Let me say 2 things. First of all, at macroeconomic level, when we talk about life insurance, I talked about life insurance that benefits from a tax exoneration. It's accidental. So that exoneration existed when there was exoneration when somebody lived and somebody died. And that was an insurance for death. You couldn't recover your money afterwards. And little by little, at the start of the 80s, we merged these 2 insurances, and we created what was a kind of a tax niche. And I think that the extent of that needs to be addressed. I don't know whether we're talking about pampered elites, but that's something that should be treated by future governments, because the feeling of inequality is so big that it's going to be necessary so that we can reset things, or at least partially reset things when inheritance is being handed down, so that we can look at tax on fortune. Now let's go back to economic opportunities. In my company, for several years, I say to all of my colleagues that if you want to study, if you're a technician and you want to become an engineer, if you're a financier and you want to do a master's, the company will finance that, but on condition that you stay for 2 or 3 years in the company. So I was told that an employee wanted to do INSEAD, and that cost 80,000 euros. And I said, the company will pay for this so that all of the employees in the company know that if they follow training, if they want to follow a course, we will pay for it. At the bottom of the ladder, if you don't have an A level, you can ask the company to finance it. So there are things that are done on a day-to-day basis in companies. Things that are done, and believe me, it's about growing this idea of accountability. Now I'll hand over to my colleague for the second question. So very quickly, and then I'll hand over to the other members of the panel.
Was whether we should add other metrics to GDP. I will just say, because there was a little bit of a discussion whether growth helps. Growth helps. Higher growth helps inequality and the progress of the bottom. I just do not want to get it. We have done enough work on what's called sustainable inclusive growth. If you have more growth, inclusivity is much higher, easier, and if you have more growth, sustainability is much higher, because the financing of sustainability is easier if you have money. Now you can add other metrics. We're actually doing that. It's called ESG, Sustainability Development Goals, and so on. And we're actually doing quite a lot of those. But I do believe that there is a simple metric, which is affordability. And it sounds like a repeat. But if you were to just say, are the basic needs affordable, i.e. income minus what the price is for the people, you'll get a much sharper metric for their progress. And we're only measuring aggregates right now. And to me, we should measure disaggregated progress, income minus what you buy, and you will get a much better metric. Now then there's some metrics that we don't measure with money, which you can add too. But with money, we can measure actually quite a lot of progress at the bottom. I would say quite a lot of the additional metrics that are chosen are great for the elites, not so great for the poor. The poor at the moment want food, energy, and being able to drive around with their car. They're not able right now. So affordability, that's the metric that I would push first.
Merci. Donc je voudrais aussi donner une chance.
Thank you. I'd also like to give the opportunity of our connected panelists to say something. I don't know whether they were able to hear the debate. I'd also like to let Branko say something. And Branko, earlier on, unfortunately, we weren't able to hear you properly. The connection was very bad. Perhaps you need to cut off your video so that we can have a greater bandwidth. Hopefully we'll be able to hear you better. I'm going to ask you to specify as well a number of data. You are one of the people who worked most on the understanding of inequalities, especially you showed that for a long period of time, income inequalities in the world went down, whereas more recently, income inequalities inside countries were increasing. Are we in a situation today where you have the two types of inequalities going up? Is that what your data is saying today? How are you seeing the future?
Well, I hope you can hear me now better. Can you tell me if you hear me?
Yes, we do hear you right now, yes. Yes.
We can hear you for the moment.
I'm very glad that you have asked this question. And it is, of course, a very nuanced question. You're absolutely right that actually in the last 4 decades, inequalities in the world, global inequality, has gone down. And it is very important to realize that it has gone down because large Asian countries like China and India more recently, and then Indonesia, Vietnam, and so forth, Bangladesh, have had high rates of growth. So in other words, growth was the element which reduced global inequality. Now the question is, what will happen to global inequality currently when we have to deal with COVID crisis, with the war in Ukraine, and with the trade conflict or trade wars to some extent between China and the US. And here we're in a very special situation. I would be very brief on that because obviously we have no time for this, but I just want to emphasize the fact that China has become a relatively rich country, and the mean income of China has outpaced the mean income in the world, means that China is no longer this engine of global inequality reduction that it used to be in the past. So our attention needs to be really focused on a continent where population is rising and which is not converging in terms of income, and this is Africa. So these are really, I think, two very important points when it comes to global inequality. When it comes to within national inequality, here the picture is also complex because in quite a few rich countries, we have not had a real increase in global within national inequalities in the last 10 years. They have been generally stable, including in France, and in some countries in Latin America, they have even gone down. So the picture is, I think, more complicated and more nuanced. Now, it could happen that we might face in the next 2 decades, and I'll stop with that, rising between country inequality if Africa does not catch up, and possible return of increasing within national inequalities, especially with what we said before about unaffordability of the essential goods or the increase in prices in fuel and energy.
Thank you very much, Branko.
Thank you, Branko. Daron, would you like to say something?
Your mic is off. Your mic is off.
Thank you, Pierre. Yes, let me make 2 comments. I think the first one is, I don't think we can get to grips with the problems of inequality that are relevant, especially for the Western world, but I think it's also true for the global aspect of inequality, without recognizing that it has a major ideological component. What is acceptable, where political power lies, and how the direction of technology and the direction of regulation have been influenced. And I think this observation makes me convinced that inequality is not something we should just debate in Davos-type meetings with, top executives and the very rich people worrying about the inequality at the bottom. I think it's a more societal problem that requires a more societal engagement. So that's number one. The second point, I just want to amplify a very important point that Gabriela made, which is that the view of many economists and policymakers have been that there is some sort of natural market process, and we let that market process work because it's efficient, and then if it generates a level of inequality that we don't like, then we use fiscal tools to redistribute, and those fiscal tools could be, income taxes, wealth taxes, universal basic income. I think this is, you can generate this type of view. For example, the celebrated Diamond-Merlis theorem in economics would be one foundation for it, but I think it's deeply misguided. Inequality is very much the fabric of how we organize production and how wages are set. And in fact, the only way to both socially and economically to reduce inequality is to investigate and to explore ways of organizing production and set wages in ways that are fairer. So just thinking, oh, well, we'll sort of find ways of reducing inequality ex post, I think that's part of the sort of the broader social aspect of inequality that has amplified so much. It has actually fueled it in some way. So I completely agree with what Gabriela said, and I just wanted to amplify that. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour ramener.
Thank you very much for bringing this important point to the table. We sadly don't have enough time to talk about it, but it's so important. Gabriela.
Well, I could not agree more with Daron. But the fact is that the reality is that the policies matter. We cannot pretend that policies that we have been following for decades have nothing to do with the increased inequalities. We cannot stop recognizing that tax systems became less progressive. Even if you capture in a photography that inequalities has not grown that much in developing countries, as Branko has mentioned, I find it unacceptable that 60% of GDP in Latin America accrue to the top 20%. So even if they don't grow, I mean, I don't think that there is more space to grow. So I really feel that we need a different way of thinking about growth itself, to invest more in those that have been lagging behind. The OECD did a fantastic job. I was there before, and we really got into household disposable income. We got into more granularity in terms of how the different deciles were faring in terms of the growth, the distribution of the benefits of growth. And the fact is that it doesn't work the way we have been measuring it and the way we have been advancing. I get very worried when I hear people saying, let's just get growth going, because we're going to get the same kind of growth that has led to this increase in inequalities and also to the climate emergency, because we are not introducing ex ante considerations related to equality or impact in social impacts and socials also regarding sustainability. And what our colleagues in site in Paris or in France are saying regarding the question of wages, I have to say that even in the more advanced economies, when you see the growth how growth was distributed even before the financial crisis, the bottom 40% of the population saw their wages stagnant. So we need to look at the distributional impacts. Now, fast forward, we are with the COVID impact. And as I said, inequalities made us less resilient because we didn't have universal health coverage, because we didn't have digital services for our kids to continue learning, because we didn't have all this infrastructure that we should have invested. And I mean, public-private, the social preferences might have something to say here, but we need those investments. And we need innovative thinking to the question that was brought, because it's not only the question of universal basic income that was brought before the COVID discussion, and everybody was saying, who's going to pay for that? Well, we invested 15 trillions. Countries invested 15 trillions to keep the economy going because of the health crisis. I think that could be have thought expenditures in a very different way. Yep. And I feel that we really need to invest more in those issues and give priority to those policies that are going to help us reduce these divergences and these paths, because they are creating the kind of societies and divisions and fragmentation that we have, but they are also bad for growth, because we stop having the contribution of low-income families, and because you have seen the high concentration in the digital world is also leading to lower productivity and lower growth. So I think a very different framework, go more granular, go income level, and measure differently and produce a different growth path.
Merci beaucoup. Malheureusement, nous avons atteint la fin.
Very sadly, we've reached the end of our time slot. I'll try and give you a few seconds to wrap up, but we are going to have to end our discussion quite quickly. And I also like to pay tribute to the work carried out by those people who are helping us to watch the clock. Of course, they have to cope with a lot of difficulties.
Un aspect important.
We're hearing a lot of talk about wages. In developing countries, there is the informal sector, which constitutes an economy per se. I just would like to stress that point. There's a third world economist called Hernando de Soto, and he invented the notion of dead capital. So these poor people in developing countries cannot register their own property, for example. I think 90% of the work that is informal so thank you very much for bringing that point to the fore. So we have reached the end of our session. I'd just like to leave you with 4 ideas, which I'm taking home from our discussion. The first one is, as Clinton would have said, it's stupid politics. So inequalities are a power play game. It's pure politics. It's not a technical question that economists can solve. It's linked to all kinds of value systems and the power ratios in society. So let's change politics. Let's change policy, which is a constant and ongoing task in all countries. But we're not saying which direction one should move forward. But as you have pointed out, economists can say all kinds of stuff, but they are just talking, they're analyzing, and they don't have the action levers. The question is now, how do we get the action up there? Gabriela mentioned another point. Inequality breeds inequality. And I'm struck by inequality of revenue and inequality in terms of opportunities. Talents aren't distributed equally, and they lead to inequality of revenue. And once you've got inequality of revenue, you get inequality in terms of opportunities. So just because you're sorting out revenue doesn't mean that you're going to have equality in opportunities. So what are acceptable inequalities? What are unacceptable inequalities? We don't have the answer to that. It's a constant, ongoing question. Third point, we need more data because we do not sufficiently know enough about inequalities. We've got an aggregated view of inequalities. We can start to say this group compared to another group, but that's not enough. We really should zone down onto the individuals, those who are suffering, and when is it right to help them. And for that, we need much more sophisticated data. We often talk in averages, and average figures aren't enough for anybody. So we need more data. I think we need to invest in a better knowledge of how revenue is distributed. And as has been said in the debate, I think all public decisions must go hand in hand with an analysis on healthcare, revenue, etc. And my final point, I'm really frustrated because the main question of the day, the ecological transition, has been outside our debate today. So I'm frustrated about that, but we have to talk about that challenge and all of the inequalities that are behind that, because we have to deal with them as well. Otherwise, we'll not be able to put in place the necessary measures. So thank you very much for listening to our panelists. Thank you to the panelists for expressing yourselves. And hopefully we'll see you next year. We won't have solved all the problems between now and then. So I'd like the audience to join me in thanking Gabriela, Daron, Branko, Augustin, Sven. Thank you very much. And thank you for attending.